Welcome to our course on asbestos signs, areas, and monitoring. Knowing when asbestos is present helps you determine what to do to work safely around it. In this course, you'll learn about regulated asbestos areas, signage, labels, and monitoring. This information will help you make informed, safe decisions to avoid asbestos exposure. By the end of this course, you will be able to recall ways to determine if asbestos is present, what signs and labels regarding asbestos mean, the purpose of regulated asbestos areas, and how employers monitor for asbestos. If they were installed before 1981, any of the following products may contain asbestos. Building materials, including sprayed-on or troweled-on surfacing material, thermal system insulation, resilient flooring, and roofing and siding. Friction materials, such as rubber gaskets, brake pads, and linings. And heat-resistant fabrics and other products, such as gloves, internal appliance insulation, and artificial ashes and embers. Treat all dust and debris from these products as if they contain asbestos. Beyond just assuming that products from prior to 1981 may contain asbestos, there are other ways you can gather information. Have qualified professionals test for the presence of asbestos. Talk to the building owners. They may have details about when the building or portions of it were constructed or modified. If they know that construction or work was done prior to 1981, you may assume that asbestos is present. They may even know of specific products in the building that contain asbestos. When asbestos products are completely intact, they are not a health hazard. If you know or suspect a product contains asbestos, look for signs of damage or deterioration. These indicate that friable asbestos may be in the air. Employers will monitor the presence of asbestos. We'll talk more about monitoring and record-keeping later in the course. Finally, read signs and labels. They may tell you if asbestos is present and what to do to avoid exposure to it. You're working on a plumbing system in a house that was built in the 1960s. The current owners tell you that the original asbestos-containing insulation around the pipes in question was replaced in 1992 when they bought the house. Should you assume that the current insulation contains asbestos? When asbestos is present at your worksite, you will receive written notices and training. You will also see signs that alert you before you get to the areas that have asbestos in them. Signs are white with a red upper panel and black lettering. They remind you why asbestos is dangerous and what protective measures to take in the area. Let's analyze this sign. Select each section to read a brief description of what it means. You must select them all before you may proceed. Who may enter the area beyond this sign? Labels are attached to anything that contains asbestos fibers, including raw materials, mixtures, scrap, waste, debris, and other products containing asbestos fibers as well as to their containers. Like signs, labels include the signal word danger and declarations about the presence and hazards of asbestos. Asbestos labels include the pictograms that indicate it is a carcinogen and an irritant. The carcinogen pictogram is a person with a white tumor overlay. The irritant pictogram is an exclamation point. Both are black with white backgrounds and red diamond frames. Because asbestos is a carcinogen, labels must also state how people may be exposed to it. In other words, they must warn people to avoid activities that create friable asbestos that they may inhale or ingest. In this example, the label warns you to avoid creating or breathing asbestos-containing dust. Carefully read labels and follow any directions they provide. Which two pictograms must be on asbestos labels? A regulated area is a designated work area within which airborne concentrations of asbestos may exceed the thresholds and exposure limits identified by regulators. Any work that may exceed asbestos exposure limits must be performed in a regulated area. Controlling the spread of asbestos dust beyond the work area is critical. Failing to do so can expose people outside the area to asbestos fibers. Asbestos fibers can even land on clothing, skin, and hair. People may carry them home where their loved ones may inhale them. The specific controls to protect people inside and outside the regulated area vary depending on the type of work and scope and severity of potential exposure. They may include plastic sheet barriers and separate negative pressure ventilation systems. People in regulated areas are supervised by a competent person who can identify asbestos hazards and select appropriate control strategies. The competent person has the authority to promptly take action, such as directing people or installing controls to eliminate asbestos hazards. No one should eat, drink, smoke, chew tobacco or gum, or apply cosmetics in a regulated area. If asbestos is on these items, people may breathe them in as they bring them to their face or ingest them through their mouths. Select the options that best complete the statements about regulated asbestos areas. Before beginning work, a competent person must complete an analysis that tells them about the presence, location, and quantity of asbestos in the area. They will use this information to determine the appropriate control systems they need to use to make sure no one inside or outside regulated areas is exposed to asbestos beyond the amounts identified by regulators. For example, many countries state that no one must be exposed to asbestos at concentrations higher than 0.1 fibers per cubic centimeter of air over an 8-hour period, or 1 fiber per cubic centimeter over 30 minutes. The competent person will continue to monitor asbestos at periodic intervals, at least every 6 months. Once their analysis indicates that asbestos levels are below the limits set by regulators, they may stop monitoring for asbestos. They must do additional monitoring when processes, control equipment, or work practices change to make sure they don't impact the concentration of asbestos in the air. Employees and their designated representatives may observe the monitoring methods that the competent person uses. Employers will notify affected employees of the monitoring results in writing, directly, or by posting a notice in a central area that employees can easily see. Please note that regulators in your area may use terms such as occupational or permissible exposure limits, excursion limits, threshold limit values, and maximum allowable concentrations to describe the amounts of asbestos that they consider unsafe. If you have questions about the terms and limits in your area, please ask your supervisor. When does a competent person complete an analysis that tells them about the presence, location, and quantity of asbestos in the area? It's not enough to simply monitor the air for asbestos. We must monitor workers, too. If you perform certain asbestos work more than 30 days per year or are exposed to asbestos beyond the regulator's limits, your employer may be required by law to provide you with a medical exam by a licensed physician at no cost to you. The exams may include a questionnaire, a physical examination, a chest X-ray, and a lung function test. Workers should receive these exams annually. The physician will send your employer their findings or diagnoses related only to asbestos exposure. The physician will not provide your employer with any of your health information that does not relate to asbestos exposure. When does a The physician may provide a written opinion to your employer about any medical conditions you have that could increase the risk of damage to your health from exposure to asbestos. For example, if you have a history of tobacco use, you may be at increased risk of developing lung diseases, including cancer due to asbestos exposure. Again, your employer needs this information to better protect you. You may be assigned to non-asbestos tasks or be required to wear additional protective equipment. You should receive a copy of all information the physician provides to your employer within 30 days of the employer receiving it. Asbestos can cause health problems decades after exposure. For this reason, your employer will keep all medical and monitoring records for the duration of your employment, plus 30 years. This includes any written opinions from your physician. Employers will keep records about your asbestos training for the duration of your employment, plus 1 year. Upon request, your employer must provide you or your legal representative with the opportunity to examine and copy their records relating to your health and asbestos exposure. Physicians will tell your employer about health conditions they discover during your asbestos exam only if the conditions are what? You should now be able to recall ways to determine if asbestos is present, what signs and labels regarding asbestos mean, the purpose of regulated asbestos areas, and how employers monitor for asbestos.